That said, I guess I'm interested in this Internet of Things discussion overall, and I've been trying to figure out some things about why it is that I'm interested in the way that I'm interested in it. And so I guess I'll probably speak more from a personal standpoint today than really about the projects that those institutions do. I think it's important that we do media, art, design, technology, that we do it in a mode of critique. And so what that means to me is doing, again, collaborative projects, extradisciplinary projects, that's a good word, extradisciplinary. And so not worrying so much about things like professional sort of links and stuff is a way of kind of getting outside of the normal discourses that happen inside these things we call design, art, technology. And so it's about trying to recover and develop means of critiquing art from the inside, design from the inside, technology from the inside, while still engaging and involving ourselves very deeply in these things. So I guess what I'm really concerned with is trying not to become like a kind of just a critical studies sort of person commenting on things that are happening in the world. But I'm also very concerned not to get too caught up with technological sort of progressivism. So I hope we're all kind of on the same page there. The reason that this is important, Jaron Lanier has this great quote where he says, "We cannot leave critique of technologies to the Luddites." Right? So we can't leave the critique of these things to people who don't understand them. Am I not? I'm usually really loud. Sorry. I can do that. This is a really strange shaped microphone. So sometimes I talk about this in terms of production versus epiduction. Time is important, right? Because it only goes in one direction. The reason that we can talk about production is because it's always about sort of this prospective future. This idea that somehow we're being productive is always something that points towards a future. Epiduction might be something that kind of, instead of always pointing in that direction, looks back and kind of at the present over and over again. And I'll go over these ideas in the later presentation. The reason this is important is because it seems like most of us live in a future that hasn't arrived yet all the time. Right? We're always projecting into technologies most of the time, these things that we expect to work, and actually most of the time are not really working. And basically, as you mentioned, I'm trying to figure out how human and non-human creativities are conditioned by the technological. So that's material, physical, and kind of engineered. So for the past few years, I've been looking at a particular kind of this present epiduction. Subduction, by the way, was suggested to me by a friend. It's basically the name for what happens when a plate in plate tectonics goes underground, right? So it's a kind of a nice reference to some later infrastructural discussions we'll have. But for this evening's talk, I'll try to keep it all very light. It'll be very kind of conceptual and oriented around ideas. I'm also really conscious that it's Friday night. It's 5 o'clock, and I'm the only thing standing between a bunch of German designers and students and beer. So let's just keep it in this mode of sort of trying to voice the strange music of the world, shall we say. The keynote format, of course, traditionally involves the following three things: a provocative general remark to foment later discussion, so you can talk about it while you're getting that beer. So I'll do that in a particular format, or a particular idea, which is what I'm calling Against Futurist Technical Imaginaries, or Cursed be the prophet, for visions of the future are the sole privilege of the gods. Followed by, of course, in all keynote speeches, attempts to substantiate hyperbole with argumentation, so you don't think I'm completely crazy. This we will call Alternate Imaginaries Thinking Infrastructure, where I will talk about various sort of strands and ideas that point towards infrastructures. And then discussion of projects as evidential corroboration. So at the very end, I'll talk about one real-world project that's happening in my life at the moment. It's called My Holy Nacho. And it's an art project, so get ready for that, I guess. And it's about how we creatively imagine or reimagine infrastructures of the internet. So some of the sessions today already, we've had some really nice talks in the afternoon. And I'm sure I heard some of the workshops sort of addressing this idea that a lot of us feel a bit weirded out by the Internet of Things, right? Even saying it feels sort of strange to me just then. There's something kind of bothering people about it. I was trying to figure this out for myself all week, and so this is what you get when you do a Google image search of Internet of Things. Just very quickly to point out, there's nothing real on that page, right? It's just a bunch of images. It's a bunch of illustrations, it's a bunch of future visions. I thought we could probably have like a little competition about which one was the most meaningless. This is my pick. I have no idea what that means. I'm certainly no expert in these things. Like I'm interested again in the discussion, but I've kind of abandoned Internet of Things for the last 10 years or so because I was kind of, I don't know, I was around for some of the beginnings, I suppose. I was reading Bruce Sterling in 2006 and sitting in Tom Igoe's Network Objects class in NYU and feeling a little bit sort of tired of these ideas. I haven't been listening that hard. So this week I went through a couple of the things that are being said. And there's a lot of obvious things that can start to irritate you, I suppose, with these visions. A lot of the visions that you see of Internet of Things tend to be things that make the world out as a kind of space of dumb problems that need to be solved, right? So here's a good example from the Bellium, who make these moats and things like that. This is a sound monitoring in bar areas and centric zones in real time. So this is a great way that the Internet of Things will make sure that the punk band down the road turns off its amps faster. And so this you might call the Internet of Cops, I guess, or some other similar vision. There are more kind of workaday visions. There's a lot of stuff that has to do with work, which is also very interesting considering different discussions that are going on nowadays about whether or not work is necessary in itself. But this is a great one. It's called How the Internet of Things Will Rule Your Workday in 2020. And there's a lot of stuff on here that would kind of make both Walter Benjamin and Guy Debord kind of roll around in their graves. This is a way in which, on his way home, Charlie's smartphone alerts him to 30% off sale at his favorite store. He is 19 times more likely to interact with the retailer after receiving the alert and heads to the mall. So this is the Internet of marketing, the Internet of shopping, the Internet of products. Then there's this whole business of smartness, which came up this afternoon already, mainly propelled by this idea that somehow the Internet of Things is going to kind of overextend human intelligence into objects. It's interesting. I think it was Despina, is that her name, brought up this idea of like smart for whom and by whom, right? Somebody's actually programming that thing. So what does smartness mean to that person? And then of course you missed it. I think you're already laughing, so you didn't miss it. The most important part is this, right? Which, apart from the tacit assumption that everybody who doesn't live in a city is stupid, there's this kind of, I guess it's the Internet of bad inference or misguided expectations. And so these are kind of the obvious things to me that, like, you don't want cops around everywhere looking at you and staring at you and surveilling you. And you don't necessarily want to have to shop every 5 seconds. And then, it's kind of obvious that some of the promises being made are a bit over-exuberant. But that really wasn't it for me. Like, those are obvious things. Those are things that would bother you about any technology. And then I started to watch this video that the EU made, which I thought we could watch together. And it's basically the story of a young man standing alone in a parking lot talking to his fridge. Sorry. 50 years. It's not that important.
Keep this on.
1,400 transport units, 520,000 kilometers per day, 1,750 hours of travel.
What do I need? Milk, eggs, bacon, fish sticks, condoms. Oh, chewing gum.
Yes, hello? No, I
Still need to order bandages.
Okay.
There aren't any more needles. Where's the...
I'll put you through.
Oh, and I still need to do this.
Don't you have the feeling we're standing still all the time? Why has it become part of our lives?
Isn't it strange that roads are getting longer? Shouldn't evolution make the world more efficient?
And while we're standing still, we pollute even more.
Why can't we focus on people instead of procedures?
What if objects start to sense and communicate, becoming tools to help us deal with complex and urgent situations?
What What if all objects were interconnected? What if there was an Internet of Things?
With the Internet of Things, applications are infinite. We could be able to monitor our transport better, winning precious time at any turn, way beyond smart logistics as we know it.
With an Internet of Things, we could be able to monitor from a distance. Instead of spending time in a hospital, people could actually live their lives.
Emptying our carts would be a thing of the past. It would also limit forgetfulness. We wouldn't even need a shopping list. We could easily ping our refrigerator at home to tell us what's missing.
If we want to be smart about energy, we could let energy be smart about itself. With the Internet of Things, we could be able to manage our world differently, adding a new dimension to the Internet as we know it.
The Internet of Things, part of our future.
I need to play it to the end so you see I didn't make it. There we go. So, it's easy to critique these kinds of things, right? It's actually a lot of fun to critique these sorts of things. Everybody's white. Gender roles are reasserted throughout. We have female nurses and businessmen. There's a tacit normalization of overworking and productivity. That woman she has too much to do all the time. And that's not the problem. It's that she should still have that much to do. It just should be handled better, right? Whoever wrote this line, "Shouldn't evolution make the world more efficient?" has clearly never read Darwin, who probably would have said no. Why does everyone seem to hate shopping lists so much? What's wrong with shopping lists? It's amazing how people hate shopping lists. And besides, maybe the problem isn't stocking up our fridge, but that it's too damn big, and that Northern Europeans expect them to be full of pineapples in December. But I digress. Does anybody know what this is? Can you just tell me right off the bat what this shape is? What? The hype cycle. There's some smart people in this room. So you slap a couple axes on it. You put a couple sort of strangely phrased periodicities at the bottom. The technology trigger, the expectation peak, the dissolution trough. Dissolution trough, sorry. The enlightened slope and the productive plateau. And you get this thing that's not just called the hype cycle, but called Gartner's hype cycle. You don't know how it works. This is essentially the idea. Things on the left are things that we think are stupid and silly. Examples are 3D bioprinting, volumetric holographic displays, quantum computing, human augmentation, and bioacoustic sensing. Things on the very far right are things that we're bored of. So 3D scanners, 3D printers, the dynamic web, remember that? Speech recognition, which I actually find kind of irritating that it's all the way over there on their cycle because it doesn't work. And this is from around the 2014 Gartner report. I guess what's more interesting about this to most people who use it is this. This is the area where you make a lot of money. And the weird thing about this curve is that it's become this kind of strangely naturalized sort of predictive device, which is supposed to describe the way that we react as societies and cultures and markets to technologies. But there's some problems with that. If you're wondering where the Internet of Things is supposed to be on this curve at the moment, it's right here. This is, again, by 2014 standards. But then every once in a while, somebody puts out something like this. Do you know what this is? So it's called an Amazon dashboard button. You put them in your house, all over your house, wherever you need a product. So if you always forget to buy toilet paper when you're on the toilet, you put it next to the toilet paper. If you always forget to buy macaroni and cheese, I guess you put it in the cupboard. When you push that button, it automatically orders that product from Amazon and delivers it to your house, right? So your house becomes this kind of strange mall where you can push the button. This came out last year, right before April Fool's Day. Everyone thought it was a joke, but it wasn't. And ever since then, there's all these marketing firms trying to figure out whether or not they meant it to be a joke, and then they just kind of, it got popular, or so anyway, something like that comes out, and then you kind of get these dips into these troughs of dissolution, of disappointment and problems. Of course, right on cue for the Amazon dashboard button, there was lots of Forbes articles about how we should follow the Gartner curve, right? This is the idea that product, even if it fails, it's preparing the world to kind of act out this inevitability that's on the Gartner curve. And so things like this also come out where big companies decide to work together. We heard about how this doesn't work this afternoon already, but actually the Gartner curve rated Internet of Things around the time that Google and Philips got together to make that happen, kind of on the slope of enlightened products. So the Internet of Things is around here, which really the only important thing to know about that is that that's where the money comes from. And so we can kind of dive a little deeper into the hype cycle itself, like why do we use this thing, and how do things get on it? Gartner's own literature, the quote, just in their documentation, Gartner writes how its analysts position technologies on the hype cycle based on a consensus agreement of hype and maturity. That's okay? Am I too loud now? So a consensus agreement based on a consensus agreement of hype and maturity. And what that really means is, a consensus agreement of hype and maturity is they sit in a room together and they talk about different things, and then they make up where the thing goes on the cycle, right? But that's important because things that are on this cycle are supposed to go through all these stages, right? So the minute they pop on there, they're like strapped to a kind of roller coaster cart, and they have to go through these different stages. The other question, of course, is like what happens after we get bored of things? That's kind of an obvious one. And a third question is, in what way is this a cycle, right? At the very end of it, you end up higher than where you started. So there's nothing cyclical about it. But I thought since again, the literature in Gartner's description of this thing, they describe it as a graphical tool, right? So this is an interesting phrase, not an analysis, not a predictive tool, but a graphical tool. So it's a picture. So I thought we could maybe try to solve their cyclical problem by cycling the Gartner cycle. So if you add 2, if you add 3, if you add 4, if you add 5, you get the idea. We get this distinct sense that the Gartner hype cycle is not an analysis of natural tendency at all, but a map of how to get somewhere, or a tool with which to get there. So what is interesting about visionary projections like Gartner's hype cycle is that they give us a sense that this cycle, which is not really a cycle, is inevitable. That the future as such is already written into a technological deployment plan that is comfortingly for some, without limit, revision, reactivity, or sensitivity to the world, it will revolutionize. This kind of visionary futurism is really just another of a number of instantiations of something that actually two great artist friends, Jamie Hilder and Brady Cranfield, are calling the economist's aesthetic, a dominant mode of naturalizing exchanges and economics as both a futurist and primary relation. Let's stop pretending that this hype cycle is a natural reaction of people to technological ideas, projects, and objects, but read it instead as what it is, a projection and a tool of desire, a control algorithm masking as an analytical model. It is the projection of a world in which slopes are enlightened, plateaus are productive, history is growth, education is investment, friendships are networks, love is a contract, and the future must pay dividends. So another way of saying all this is this wonderful Romanian polymath, Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen, who once said, "The favorite thesis of economists is that the power of technology is without limits. We will always be able to increase the productivity of any kind of energy and material. Nothing, therefore, could ever stand in the way of an increasingly happier existence of the human species. One can hardly think of a more blunt form of linear thinking." So there's just kind of a critique of cycles. This shouldn't really be surprising. This is the headquarters of Gartner Incorporated. It was founded in 1979 by a guy named Gideon Gartner, who was an ex-strategic air command and control systems engineer from MIT, and he saw this opportunity to do what he called continuous consulting to the financial industry. This is in Stamford, Connecticut. Does anyone know where that is or why that's important in America? It has the highest concentration of headquarters, of corporate headquarters in America, which is saying something, right? I mean, it's the highest concentration of headquarters in America. So there's a sort of linkage here. The hype cycle got its start in 1995, but this is the book that kind of launched it on its way in 2008. I guess the most important part is this, right? It's authored by a couple of consultants within the company. This is a picture from in Stamford, Connecticut, of the last year's. This was actually Leading in a Digital World, Strategy, Risk, and Business Transformation Sessions for the Insurance Governance Leadership Network. The only reason I put this here is because it just occurred to me when I saw this image. It's kind of interesting how natural the alliance between futurists and insurance salespeople are, right? Like one of them makes money by creating these projections of visions and that people are supposed to live up to, and the other makes money off of everything that goes wrong while they're trying to live up to that. So Gartner has a couple other products that are available. The Gartner Magic Quadrants, it's my favorite name of all their products, which offers visual snapshots, in-depth analyses, and actionable advice that provide insight into a market's direction, maturity, and competitive participants. There's this thing, which is called the Gartner Market Scope, a way to rate vendors based on criteria that focus on the important aspects of an emerging or mature market, overcoming problems with the typical criteria typically used in Magic Quadrant analysis. So you need this one if you're using the other one. Anyway, I'd like to offer up a new analysis tool. Instead of Gartner's Hype Cycle, I give you Jamie's Cycle Hype, which is a tool that allows you at will to project the inevitability of any technology into any future ad nauseum and devoid of any acknowledgement of contingency, critical analysis, or techno-skepticism with which any future should be sensibly approached. Or wait, I think Gartner already has that. That's the problem. So what we see here, of course, is something which we can kind of draw on the writings of Franco Berardi, who will come up later in this talk, the close relationship between futurism and advertising, which is an integral part of the mobilization of psychic energy as capital. Now, this is everywhere in the Internet of Things discourse, and this is, I think, probably why we need so much critique of it and why we've already heard a bit about that today. This is a particular number that keeps coming up, 50 billion, right? We've heard it like 3 times in the afternoon anyway. I have no idea what that number means. So I decided to try to look it up, of course. It's on Cisco's website. Cisco's essentially the sort of reference for this number, 50 billion, which is like 7 times the population of the planet, right, of people. And the full quote is, Cisco estimates that 50 billion devices and objects will be connected to the internet by 2020. Yet today, more than 99% of things in the physical world remain unconnected. I'll just let you think about that for a minute, because that's an ontological conundrum, right? Like, how do you measure all the things in the world in order to divide them by whatever not connected, right? It's totally incredible. And so this 50 billion number is again, kind of made up. It starts to remind you, all of this rhetoric, about a very old but very new phenomenon, which we variously called the tyranny of options, ostensibly invented by Henry Ford, who said any customer can have any car painted any color that he wants, so long as it is black. So this inevitability that's being written into hype cycles, futurist sort of projectionism, is kind of what I wanted to talk about. So perhaps the reason that the Internet of Things vision and hype cycles make a lot of us feel weird or uncomfortable is precisely that they are visions. Visions designed to feel inevitable. Gartner's hype cycle, again, not in any way a cycle, oozes inevitability and does so by referencing the scales and temporalities of forces formerly known as nature. The ingenious recycling systems we call seasonal cycles, carbon cycles, and Krebs cycles developed over millennia and comparatively truly impressive in their actual cyclicalness, right? When we tune into these visionary futures, we have to remember that the future is not a place that we can look into. We cannot have any true vision of it. This is a dangerous modernist method. Our technical visions seem to forever come from a future that is overdetermined, overpraised, and overpromised. It is the future as naturalized, fertile ground from which we take ideas, mind concepts, and hope. It's no wonder the future has started to feel a bit empty. We've been extracting ideas from it for the past 30 or 40 years. Instead of building and creating in ways that force us to take stock of the infrastructural repercussions of these visions and creating them hopefully together in the present, we wind up clamoring toward a set of interconnected, smart, totalized systems that fulfill an economic logic of limitless increase and truly cynical, blind escapism. This is still the dominant way we teach the practice of design, the technical skills of engineering, as well as modern art and other kinds of technology development. And they're all reactions to the technological wet dreams of governments, accountants, unimaginative policymakers, and corporations. This is why I find predictions about the future so problematic. Peter Fleming writes in an article that just came out on Tuesday called "What is the Point of Work?" What is in fact a projection of partisan political ambitions onto an otherwise open future, and onto those less able to defend themselves from such projections, our children, ought to be stringently challenged. And so it is in this way, and as a way of fulfilling my role as provocative keynote speaker here this evening, that I call us to at least entertain a notion of anti-futurism, and one that might even refuse the demand that we be able to explicitly describe this future before we have the right to desire it. I ask all of us here this evening to let go of our modernist, designerly, architectural, avant-gardist impulses and join me in what I hold to be a highly therapeutic exclamation: ladies and gentlemen, fuck the future. Thank you very much. Just kidding. Good joke. So the future is a safe, sterile, I just want to back off now. That's the back off part. This future that I want to fuck is basically this idea that we have no other options for ways of thinking about the future of technologies, right? So this is Ursula Le Guin, who's actually a science fiction writer, who writes, "The future is a safe, sterile laboratory for trying out ideas, a means of thinking about reality, a method." And the point here is that she's underlining how the future is but one amongst many methods for thinking about reality, and for the development of technologies, designs, medias, and arts in such a reality. And one that perhaps is not even the most challenging or interesting most of the time, right? It's sterile. So the projection of this is again Franco Berardi, who his book After the Future is a big kind of inspiration for a lot of what I've been thinking about this. The projection of the world can be frozen and become mere illusion, self-deception. If we think that the imagined world is independent from imagination, and if we think that the imagining self is independent from communication and from becoming in the world, right? This is where futurism becomes a kind of a space that we start to kind of pull things from. So yeah, if any of these ideas sort of resonate with you and you're interested to read further about this kind of future skepticism, this is Franco Berardi's book, After the Future. It was suggested to me by a brilliant friend named Paolo Patelli, so I just wanted to mention. Futurism will remain a dominant mode of thinking about reality, but are there opportunities for other kinds of thinking? Obviously, I think the answer is yes. So here's suggestions. Presentism. Presentism might be a way of designing, building, and thinking about that looks at a future not as a place from which ideas come, but as something we build together out of what has arrived from the present, into the present from the past. Berardi here calls this a celebration of the infinite nature of the present. To be clear, it is not the kind of presentism discussed in cultural studies that ignores history. The point for Berardi is that speculation has become the dominant mode of institutional markets and capital, and so creative pursuits, art, technology, and design, I guess, should take up counter modes of reconcretization of history and ideas. As Berardi here cites Agamben, who talks about recombining the word and the meaning in the body, right? So this is the idea that like everything is kind of magicalized. We have markets that fail for no reason. We have everything that we thought was concrete, like economies and states and things like that. Those are magical. So can we use our sort of skill sets as creative individuals to reconcretize the world? So for Berardi, futurism is literally bankrupt. Today we have futurism without a future. that now authorizes innumerable violences, and our responsibility, our ability to respond, comes in rerouting ourselves in material physical bodies, in what has happened and what is happening, and in direct opposition to the kind of overzealous escapism that has beset Western modernity for the past few centuries. Futurism is just, it can no longer be our only option. And so to point towards a kind of concept of infrastructures, this is another way of talking about maybe this idea of presentism coming from Karen McDowell, who's just a regular old information security analyst at the University of Western Virginia. She says, the Internet of Things refers to devices in our environment that connect to the internet. But what's the difference between a computer and a thing in the IoT? Not much, right? So I guess one way of expressing this, again, in the context of Internet of Things, is that the Internet of Things, I mean, the Internet's already made of a lot of things, right? And so we can start to imagine alternate imaginaries of a world that's already got these things in it. Quickly, I'll go through this idea of technical imaginaries as a whole. So the reason I want to say this is because a lot of this infrastructures discussion that I'm about to go into, it tends to be this kind of strange realism, right? We're looking at a bunch of cables that are kind of interconnected. It's supposed to give you a better sense of how something works, but even your average engineer would walk in that room and be like, I have no idea what that is, it's just a bunch of wires, right? And so what I'm trying to pick apart here is a bit of a subtle argument about the ways in which different kinds of imaginaries give you different kinds of affordances, but they're not any better or any more realistic or any more kind of obvious than others. A technical imaginary is what? Thank you to Moritz for this project by Noah Veltman, Moritz Greiner-Peter, who some of you I think know. He just pointed me out to this project. A technological imaginary, if you think of it visually, is kind of like this. So Noah's project is to collect drawings of the internet from different technical drawings, right? So sometimes it look like a cloud, sometimes it look like a bean, sometimes it look like a web, sometimes it look like an explosion. That's amazing. Sometimes it look like weird lumps. So the idea is that we are always imagining the way that these technologies are in the world. And so another way of saying this is something Matt Jones recently said, I think in a talk, which is that people are always going to create folklore around technologies. What is important is which folklores they create. So how do we use sort of infrastructural thinking in a particular way as a particular kind of imaginary? Other imaginaries that are out there, which I just realized I don't have time to go into for very long. Technoscapes, this is Arjun Appadurai, sort of theorist who talked about the technoscape, which has a certain kind of aesthetic, or a certain kind of affordances in terms of how you think about technology. It's basically about perspectives of different people, so it really centers the person or the social. Technospheres, there's a recent event by this same name at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin that I was at. Really interesting, but also a kind of, again, an aesthetic, right? Spheres are smooth, they're particularly sort of uniform, they have surface characteristics, but they're difficult to change. And so there's sort of pluses and minuses for all these different technical imaginaries. Platforms, I just read this wonderful article by Shannon Mattern where she talks about how platforms, you can talk about technologies in general as platforms, but they always smack of Silicon Valley sort of knowledge solutions. But then even more subtly, the image they evoke is a flat two-dimensional stage on which resources are laid out for people to do stuff with. The platform doesn't have any implied depth, right? So in a way, platforms have no infrastructure. Networks is another technical imaginary. The sort of work that people like Bruno Latour have extended this into, I guess, a kind of concept of reality, how everything is a network. You are what you are connected to. There's a lot of great critiques of this now coming out. Alex Galloway writes of how networks are ahistorical and naturalized. They're totalizing and foreclosing, and they're non-ideological, so they don't really give you much in the way of agency to change things. Sorry that was quick, but I wanted to get to this. It's important that we situate, amongst these technological imaginaries, infrastructure. And by infrastructure, I don't mean just the more straightforward governmental notion of developing profiles of pipes and cables and such, but as an expanded realist, presentist mode of thinking about technology and how these things come together. So we can think of the work of people like Susan Lee Starr and Jeffrey Bowker, who very provocatively did this thing called ethnographies of infrastructure. right? Ethnographies of infrastructure, which is incredible because it's sort of suggesting that infrastructures have an ethnos, right? Have a people, a folk, or a power like a people and a folk. Infrastructures are here very Foucauldian. They are conditions of possibility, the installed base of the present, necessarily informing the future and structuring our lives and thinking. Reality must always be backward compatible. So some aspects of infrastructure: historical, inaccessible, you have to negotiate access to them. They're material, they're messy, they're never not on, so they're sort of part of a kind of assumed structure. They're opaque, they're tangled, and they're geopolitical. How do we creatively reimagine and concretize the technologies that constitute our present? Right? This is what infrastructural thinking kind of gives us. It gives us a way of developing a sensibility for the ways that material infrastructures form a condition for the possibility of acting in the world, and they produce strategies, once this kind of sensibility is in place, for guiding and collaborating with these non-human and human agencies in thoughtful and reflexive ways. So there's lots of projects that I could point to, yeah? There's lots of work in the world as evidence of what I'm talking about. Timo Arnal and Berg's work, looking at immaterials, right, which is kind of a physical visualization, shall we say, but it's not a visualization because it's actually a sort of manifesting the radio frequency waves of RFID. Critical engineering is a group of people based out of Berlin, I think, more or less, who are doing lots of work in this area, looking at sort of cell phone networks and things like that, and hacking into them in order to show them as kind of constantly there infrastructures. Benjamin Bratton's more politically oriented work, and actually sort of strangely futurist but dystopian futurist work looking at black stacks, which is a kind of new infrastructural model. Other more kind of cultural studies work, Hui Hu, who's got a great new book out called A Prehistory of the Cloud. Lisa Parks's work on satellites and stuff. These two are interesting because they're doing histories of infrastructures, right? So it's a way of avoiding this problem of ahistorical network analyses. Making the Geological Now is a project of a couple years ago that really looked at the Earth as an infrastructure. Because in a way, the fundamental infrastructure of all of our activity is the Earth or maybe the sun, right? Tubes is a great book by Andrew Bloom, which is a bit more popular about the actual physical infrastructure of the internet. And then just to expand on this idea of like infrastructural thinking, people like Bruno Latour, who are working to kind of, who I mentioned before, who are working to kind of disentangle, I guess, things that seem like these rooms of messy wires, but then treating all of modernity like that. It seems to me like a kind of infrastructural thought. Alex Galloway, who probably wouldn't enjoy being on the same slide as Bruno Latour, they're kind of fighting, is also an infrastructural thinker. He had a book a couple of years ago called Protocol, which was a similar sort of argument. And then let's not forget to read fiction, right? Jose Saramago has a wonderful story called The Lives of Things, where everything in our environs goes on strike. It just stops working. And so you pour water into a cup, but the cup just doesn't hold the water for whatever reason. And so it's something for Internet of Things interested people to read, I think. Whenever I get a chance to talk to anybody about the idea of agencies of objects and Internet of Things, I need for you to see this movie. We had a couple examples of dystopian visions, or somebody mentioned in the workshop about dystopian visions. Maximum Overdrive is a 1986 movie about basically about all of the mechanical and electrical hardware in our lives going crazy and killing everybody. And it was a Stephen King book and then turned into a film. The soundtrack's by AC/DC. Okay, so just to finish up and talk a bit about something I'm doing at the moment. Instead of the Internet of Things, then, could a presentist infrastructural art practice or project practice take place as a thing of the internet, right? So if we wanted to trace out what the present of the internet can do, shall we say, or the present of our infrastructures can do, how do we do that? This is a project called My Holy Nacho. It is a collaboration between myself and a fellow named Bernhard Garnisnig from Vienna. So how do you trace potentialities and agencies of online infrastructures without reducing them to routers and switches, servers and CPUs? So this is the point. I mean, infrastructures are not just these things, yeah? They're not, I mean, you can show me many sublime, beautiful images of Google's dataplexes, but that's not what drives the internet. Somebody's fixing those things and staring at those TXRX lights and, There's a whole sort of larger infrastructure that we should be accounting for when we think infrastructurally. Here's a little video. By the way, my holy nacho is a mishearing of the name Maholi Naji. So we were sitting here talking about this project, and I was like, it's a bit like that telephone painting by because Americans say Maholi Nagi or Maholi Naji or like all these really badly pronounced Hungarian. And Bernhard was there. He's like, "What'd you just say, my holy nacho?" My Holy Nacho is a durational infrastructural sculpture. A single object is sent to different manufacturers and workshops to have various processes applied to it. Each online orderable process is chosen in secret and in turn. So it looks a little bit like this. It starts with a web form, starts with an order of a single object, then it traverses the world. It's been going on for 2 years now. And it has had one exhibition, which I'll show in a minute, but is about to kind of culminate in April 2016. So what the idea is like, how does stuff like this turn into stuff like this? How do you account for all these sort of micro activities that, sorry, I went the wrong way. That are the powers of clicks, the powers of kind of a massive infrastructure that is not just the internet itself, but these sort of things that are hooked up to it and agencies that are available to you. I can get someone to speed dry something. I can get someone to vacuum form something, and basically at the click of a button. So this is a way of kind of actioning out these processes. We had an exhibition fairly recently in Aarhus, Denmark, at the Kunsthal there. A lovely space.
Next om med, det har vi tid til.
So it went on quite a journey. This is a kind of part of the exhibition process was to sort of try to example how some of these processes occurred. This is ostensibly a map of kind of where it went. The interesting thing is that from all the data that was generated from it, and from all the kind of smartness we were trying to enable this whole object with in terms of automated ordering and stuff, it's incredibly messy, right? Like you have to, all the semantic and contextual information about like, could you cover this in plastic, please? It just doesn't take. You have to sort of have a conversation with each of these people, and so there's still a lot of kind of, I guess, non-Internet of Things sort of interactions. The dashboard button for a sculpture does not exist yet. It generated a lot of data though, and essentially we're working on a kind of web piece for it. But the various things that were revealed about the project is that the present state of futuristic network of physical things and material manipulations is essentially that nothing really works. The web form is never final, and the semantic world of meanings, contexts, and intentions in which human beings exist are never interpreted correctly by the current protocols and systems. There's a little bit of online interest in this. This is just my favorite sort of quote. This is what happens when the internet blindly creates a work of art. And then a lovely thing by Robert Jackson, who's a kind of philosopher of technology, the unavoidable creative mystifications of unpredictability that take place in between various modes of control. So upcoming in April, if you're in Copenhagen, we're going to put that object into this space and cut slices into it so that we can make kind of little sandwiches out of it. Because nobody knows what's in it, right? It's kind of amazing. So that's a brief little romp through a project. I guess the point of that is, could we seek to develop an Internet of Things that was a bit more like these kinds of things of the Internet, in their ability to trace out the communities and agencies of people and things in the present? How can we develop an awareness of infrastructure and avoid the pitfalls of a futurist gaze that presumes the banality of talking fridges and daily commutes? Surely, the infrastructuring of the future should not be left to the futurists alone. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much for that. I'm not going to say vision now, because that would just be ironic. Do we have any questions to Jamie Allen? No? Okay, I have a few. I can